Hillsdale College. I hope you all are enjoying the beautiful weather. Obviously, it must be global warming. Of course, when the weather returns to 30 degrees tomorrow, then it will be because of climate change. I tell you, it's hard to keep up with the terminology. It's a good thing that I'm taking this CCA. My name is Brandon Butts. I'm a senior pursuing a marketing management major. I'm team captain of the forensics competitive speech team and a member of Delta Tau Delta fraternity here on campus. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Kenneth P. Green to our campus today. Kenneth P. Green is Senior Director of the Center for Natural Resources at the Fraser Institute. Dr. Green earned a bachelor's degree in biology from UCLA, a master's degree in molecular genetics from San Diego State University, and a PhD in environmental science and engineering from UCLA. He has studied environmental, energy, and natural resource policy at several think tanks, including the Reason Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Green has testified before several state and federal legislative bodies in the United States, including committees and subcommittees of the House of Representatives and the Senate. He twice reviewed reports for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He is the author of 2 textbooks, Global Warming, Understanding the Debate, and Abundant Energy, the Fuel of Human Flourishing. Please help me welcome Dr. Kenneth P. Green.
Well, thank you all for being here this afternoon. Let me bring my notes back up. I'm paperless, so. Again, thank you for being here. All the more, it's a pleasure to be down here from Calgary, Alberta. All the more so because it was minus 15 degrees centigrade today. And I get to miss some of the worst of the current polar vortex that's going through. But my consolation is we have a conservative prime minister and you don't, so. I'd like to thank Hillsdale College, particularly Matt Bell, for inviting me to speak to you today, to offering up such a spectacular podium, great venue, and such an esteemed list of fellow speakers, who unfortunately I won't get to see all of them because I don't have enough time to stay, but I know you're going to be educated, infuriated, and entertained by the speakers in the next day. I also want to compliment Hillsdale. It's a lovely campus. The facilities that I said are beautiful. I was going to take a selfie of myself with Ronald Reagan out in the quad, and I realized that Ronald Reagan was, rightfully so, larger than life, and that if I did take a picture with him, I'd look a bit like a dwarf. And then it occurred to me to ask, maybe they did that on purpose, to discourage people from taking disrespectful selfies because it would make you look small. If so, very smart. Today's lunch speaker was a hard act to follow, particularly his PowerPoint deck, and his bank account. I'm glad I'm going where I am because your evening speaker, Steve Hayward, who's back there in the audience somewhere, will doubtlessly put me to shame when he gives his presentation. I won't be using as PowerPoint today, by the way. As the saying goes, absolute power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So today we're going to talk about what I think of as an actually iconic example of how an environmental policy can go totally wrong. The policy, which we refer to as the ethanol mandate, is the legal requirement that you mix ethanol into your gasoline, the gasoline you put in your cars, at 10%, at a 10% level right now. So first we'll start with a little bit of background information on gasoline and ethanol, and then we'll get to the politics. If I get too far into the weeds, feel free to interrupt. I can hear you from back on the other side of the football field. So gasoline, as you know, is just a component of oil. It's that lovely black stuff that squirts out of the ground and turns into money. To be specific, gasoline is a blend of lightweight hydrocarbons, that's chains made of hydrogen and carbon, that range from 4 to 12 carbon atoms. That is, they're very light. They're the lightest components, some of the lightest components of oil. You isolate gasoline, or petrol as we call it up north, where we unfortunately tax it much more highly than you do. From oil, you get it from oil through a process called fractional distillation, which we'll talk about a little bit, but not much. For gasoline, that happens in a refinery. And the joyful thing about oil is that it contains within itself all the energy you need to break it apart into the amazingly useful things we get, like gasoline, aviation gas, diesel, plastics, fertilizers, etc. Ethanol, as you probably know. How many people know what ethanol is? Oh, very good. We have a highly educated. How many of you consume it on a regular basis? How many of you consume too much of it on a regular basis? So ethanol, as you probably know, is a type of alcohol. It's the stuff that gets you potted. Other types of alcohol that you probably heard of are methanol, isopropyl alcohol. Those won't get you potted. However, they might get you planted if you consume them because they're toxic. Alcohol is also a carbon chain, but it's got a specific chemical group attached to it that makes it an alcohol. We don't need to get into that. I'm sure you all remember your advanced biochemistry from college. You all remember your biochemistry? Ethanol is made from sugar, and glucose to be specific, the stuff that plants make when you expose them to sunlight and give them sufficient water. You can get sugar from many different plants. It makes for the four basic booze groups. Sugarcane, of course, gives us rum, but the potatoes and wheat give us vodka, rice gives us sake, barley gives us beer, the staff of life, grapes give us wine, and corn, we get moonshine, basically. Starch, any kind of starch, is just composed of sugar molecules. You can break it down and feed it to yeast, and we make them. They generate beer. They raise raise your bread, leaven your bread. They ferment your cheeses. We also get things like antibiotics from yeast, and for that matter, we get yeast infections from yeast. But that's for another class. Anyway, to make ethanol, you feed sugar to yeast in a liquid solution. The little critters go through a process called fermentation. They create the alcohol molecules, and lo and behold, it starts to build up in the solution until at the high of 20% or so, it starts to kill the little yeasties, and they stop making it, not surprisingly. At that point, fermentation usually stops even lower than that. And at that point, you face the challenge now of getting the ethanol out of the mixture of water, right? So what you do is you distill it. That is, you heat the solution up just to the point where the alcohol comes off in steam and the water stays behind. And you do that repeatedly. You cool the steam down into a liquid. You run it through over and over again. If you really want it pure, there's another chemical step, and voila, you have purified ethanol. So we should note, and the chemistry lesson is almost over. We should note at this point that there's a big difference between ethanol and gasoline, right? Gasoline came to us because we just took a fraction off of an energy-rich substance for a fuel. We had to actually make the ethanol with an input of energy so that we could then consume its fuel, its energy content in another way. And that actually was the first argument being made against ethanol by people who were of an engineering mentality, that it takes more energy in than it gets out. And it's an interesting but not terribly useful argument against ethanol, and that's why we wound up stuck with the ethanol mandate, is because in this case, if you want a liquid fuel, you are willing to pay more for that fuel in terms of energy input if the other kind of fuel that you're using isn't suitable for your task, right? So if I really want a liquid fuel and all I have is coal, it doesn't matter that I have to take more of the energy from coal to make less energy in the ethanol because I want a liquid fuel. And so it's not really a good argument. It's true, but it's not a good argument. It's the same pretty much of everything we use, as a matter of fact. If I want aluminum, pure aluminum, I don't really care if the energy left in the bonds of the metal atoms is more than the humongous amount of energy it took for me to mine, process, and make the aluminum in the first place, because there wasn't much I was going to be able to. I can't wrap my food in bauxite, right? I can wrap my food in aluminum foil, so I don't really care very much about that. So enough with the chemistry. Let's get to the policy. How did we get here? Well, the ethanol story, and Matt, where are you? Can you give me a time marker when you're, okay. Give me a time marker if we get off cycle here. The ethanol story is a pretty long one. In fact, ethanol and turpentine were used to power internal combustion engines all the way back in 1826. It was also a component of lamp fuel in the 1850s, and in 1908, Henry Ford's Model T was, amazingly enough, a flex fuel vehicle that could run on either ethanol or gasoline, the advantage of much simpler engineering. For various reasons, including lots of cheap oil, ethanol lost out to gasoline as the motor fuel of choice. And in the Q&A we can discuss this, but it's a very similar reason to why electric cars lost out to gasoline, is because they just couldn't match the performance and the energy density of gasoline, which is a seminar I could give all by itself, because it's wonderful stuff. If it didn't exist, we'd have to have invented it. And that's where things stood. Ethanol was a niche use until our friends in OPEC shook things up in the 1973 oil embargo, exposing Americans to long gas lines and high prices. I should tell you that at that point I could have been one of the country's first ethanol moguls. After pushing the family car into the gas lines for enough times, I was already a geek when I was a young man. And so I got interested in this popular science, and Popular Mechanics started putting out articles about run your car on ethanol, right? And I thought, hey, that's a great idea. I was living in California at the time in the San Fernando Valley, which is a giant orange grove, really. And they have, every year they have a humongous amount of oranges that just basically get rounded up and thrown in the landfill. And I thought, hey, you know, if I could gather some of those up, I could ferment them, distill some ethanol, and we could spike the gas in the family car with the ethanol, and maybe even sell some to friends. And I could have been a mogul, but I even had still designs that were solar to talk about how environmentally forward-looking I was. I had solar still designs that I had ordered through Popular Science. But the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was not amused at the idea of a 13-year-old boy distilling alcohol in his backyard, and so the experiment, I'm afraid, didn't go very far forward. Ethanol took off as a fuel after Richard Nixon, who you thought you already had reasons to hate, made it a goal for the United States to get off of foreign oil. And starting around 1978, Congress started creating incentives for the production of ethanol to be mixed into the gas supply, and we've been stuck with the stuff in greater and lesser quantities ever since. A parallel driver of the ethanol fuel craze was California regulators. They needed to add something to gasoline in the wintertime to bring carbon monoxide levels down in your car. They first started going with a chemical called MTBE, which was an oil byproduct. Turns out MTBE is so slippery that when you put it in tanks, you might as well just be putting it in a sieve. And so they contaminated virtually every gas station in California with MTBE. So they switched then to an alternative, which was ethanol, and that created the modern ethanol fuel industry. So the drivers were political. The industry was existed in California that could be exploited, and it was. Ethanol got the biggest boost, really big boost, when George W. Bush, who famously abstained from drinking the stuff, maybe this was part of the problem, expressed a fondness for ethanol fuel in his 2006 energy speech, the first time I think in history that a president ever discussed switchgrass, which he followed up by signing a renewable fuel standard in 2007 that called for the U.S. to use 36 billion gallons of biofuels by 2022, with 15 million consisting of conventional corn ethanol and 21 billion gallons consisting of advanced biofuels such as ethanol made from different materials other than food, woody materials that are non-food woody materials and grasses. We'll talk about that in a bit. So, but a funny thing happened on the way to our happy ethanol future. Over the years, it's become clear that ethanol poses a lot of environmental problems. One of the most serious ones is overuse and destruction of land and water. According to a couple of scientists in Science magazine, refining a gallon of corn ethanol requires 35 gallons of water. But that's just the refining. When you add up what's needed to grow the corn, because a lot of corn in the United States is irrigated, it turns out to be and if you just look at corn specifically destined to be a fuel, it takes 140 gallons of water to make a gallon of ethanol that's produced. Now, as you probably heard last night, environmentalists are screaming about the water consumption used in fracking, but they've always been curiously silent about the water use consumed in making fuel ethanol, which they promoted as a carbon-neutral fuel. In addition to overusing water, ethanol production also pollutes the water that we have. In a research from the National Research Council, they pointed out that corn ethanol, more corn for ethanol means more fertilizers, more pesticides, and more herbicides hitting the waterways, more low oxygen dead zones off the coasts, more fertilizer runoff off the coasts and in bayous and bays, and more local shortages in water for drinking and irrigation. It also creates far-reaching problems in the places like the Gulf of Mexico and the Chesapeake Bay, where fertilizer runs off, microbes in the water consume it, they also consume all the oxygen, and that creates giant dead zones where there's not enough oxygen for fish or shellfish to survive. And the more ethanol we make, the more that pollution gets worse. It also consumes a lot of land. In a science article from 2008, researchers calculated that producing the 15 billion gallons of corn ethanol to meet the U.S. goals would require the diversion of corn from 12 million hectares of U.S. cropland, which would in turn bring 11 million hectares of additional land into cultivation. Those locations: Brazil, the rainforests, 2.3 million acres in China, and India, 2.2 million new acres brought under cultivation here in the United States. So if you like land being used for something other than just living on in agriculture, you have to conclude that ethanol was a bad bargain with regard to protecting the environment. Curious enough, when you add ethanol to your fuel, it actually creates more conventional pollutants. And who said that? Your US EPA. In 1997, they admitted that adding ethanol to the gasoline means more nitrous oxides, more greenhouse gases than regular gasoline, and particularly methane and carbon dioxide. The findings have been validated since, especially with regard to the greenhouse gases. Turns out when you level land for cultivation, the initial release of greenhouse gases is so large that it takes over 30 years well, you'd have twice the greenhouse gas emissions if you looked at it over a 30-year timeline than if you had just gone with gasoline. And it's over 167 years before you really cancel out the initial pulse of gases you put up with the smaller amount you generate when you use the ethanol. Nationwide, I can go on with some statistics, but it creates more volatile organic carbon compounds. That's the stuff you see as haze. It makes more nitrous oxides, which lead to ozone formation, and so forth. So on all fronts, environmental, it's a very bad deal. Well, what about claims it'll bring down gasoline prices by substituting oil, gasoline from expensive and always peaking oil? I was on the radio the other day, and my opponent said, we know that the oil prices are only going to go up. And I said, have you looked at the oil price lately? It's not always going up. But that's another story. Peak oil, again, we could spend an hour on peak oil. So if you actually look at what happens with gasoline, it turns out that, and those of us who understand markets know this intuitively, right? Which is, if I'm going to sell you ethanol, and I'm a private producer, I'm going to sell it to you at the same price as you'd pay for an equivalent amount of gasoline. I'm going to sell it to you for the same energy content you'd get from gasoline, which means I'll sell it to you for about 67% of the price of current gasoline, because you need 67%, that you only get 67% of the energy out of a gallon. So I'll sell you a gallon of my ethanol at 2/3 the price of gasoline, since that'll take you 2/3 as far. And so when people have looked at the price of gasoline in the United States, it is not brought down by ethanol. Well, but somebody will say, well, but that's only the first generation of biofuels. To which I would reply, having started in 1908, it's a very long generation. It might be the longest generation. It's the only older orphan or infant energy sector that I can think of is wind, which of course has been around since the time of sailing ships. But so I would say, again, the second generation is going to be made from cellulose, which is the woody stems of corn or grasses or trees or this podium or the shells of shrimp or the shells of insects. It's going to be made from cellulose, and therefore it won't have any of these nasty effects that you're talking about. And they mandated that we were going to use a lot of the cellulosic ethanol in the EPA. There's only one small problem with it, which is, first of all, if it uses any kind of crop at all, corn stems are the same as the corn ears, all of the land and growth problems are the same. You still have to water the corn to get the stem or the stalk. You still have to water the grasses to get the grasses. And you still have to spend huge amounts of energy concentrating woody, pulpy material to get it into and turn it into fuel. You also have to use great deals of energy to crack the cellulose apart. The reason it's cellulose is evolutionarily a very tough material. In case you've forgotten, cellulose is the material that is in the cell walls of plants that allow trees to grow up and not flop over, right? So it tells you how it's a very difficult material to break down. And so it turns out you have to, if you're trying to break it down, you wind up putting even more energy into your ethanol, creating more greenhouse gases and creating more conventional pollutants. But more importantly, it's extremely expensive to make. No one has successfully made it commercially, which takes us to the very interesting phenomenon in which the companies were fined by the Treasury because they failed. They were fined about $7 million in penalties for failing to mix cellulosic ethanol, a fuel that didn't exist, into gasoline. They recently finally got out from under that particular penalty. And here's the worst part, and this is so common in environmental policies, which is they're promulgated by relatively wealthy city dwellers, and they almost invariably hurt poorer people and rural people. Ethanol raises the price of food because it diverts corn from the food supply that would be fed to animals. And as it commands a higher price as ethanol, subsidized ethanol, it means that corn prices rise, and that means animal feed prices rise, and that means if your poultry and your beef and everything else go up with it. And if you've looked at the prices of beef lately, you'll know it's well and true. The U.S. projections are by 2016, the U.S. will have diverted 43% of its cropland just to produce ethanol fuel. Almost half. It's an interesting statistic because in the past, actually, before cars, the U.S. had half of its farmland was devoted just to growing hay for horses, which is considerably more benign, actually, activity. Food prices went up around the world because of ethanol. There were nearly riots in Mexico over the price of tortillas at the peak when the new ethanol mandates came in. The World Trade Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, the International Monetary Fund, and the OECD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the World Food Program, the International Food Policy Research Institute, UN High-Level Task Force on this, and the World Bank all concluded the same thing. The use of ethanol in fuel raises food prices and harms the poor, disproportionately harms the poor. The head of the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, has called for the termination of biofuel use, and so have even some environmental organizations have finally figured this out and have gently backed away from supporting ethanol. And when I mention biofuels, I should throw in a quick caveat, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. Anytime, the basic logic of this is simple. If you put a bounty or a price on an acre of land that is higher than its comparative uses, whether it's forest, whether it's wilderness area, whether it's campgrounds, whether it's existing crops, you know how markets work, right? More land will be planted under that artificially subsidized crop at the expense of anything. And this is particularly true in developing countries where they don't have good environmental protections. And land set aside is that the very places that the environmentalists are saying these are the lungs of the planet are being cut down to make biofuels to sell into the European and American markets. Even, and this is a miracle, so hallelujah, even Dianne Feinstein sponsored a bill to end the ethanol mandate the bill was killed, as everything has gone, in the great legislative graveyard of the Senate. But there are still some other reform efforts. But the final lesson of the ethanol story, the real story of ethanol, is this. Once you build an industry that depends on subsidies and fuel mandates to make its profit, they learn the levers of power really, really fast. And they learn how to buy themselves influence to maintain the flow of fuel to their particular bank accounts. And for years now, probably well over 10, 15 years, we've known this was a very bad deal. But the ethanol industry has shown it's easy, very easy to get a pig to a trough. It's not so easy to get them away from it. And with that, we have lots of time for questions. We can discuss anything you want to. When I was introduced, I've written about climate change. I've written about most of these things for quite a long time. So I'm fair game on almost anything you want to talk about, including Canada, the true north, strong and free, and our hockey teams. Go Flames, go. Thank you. That wasn't too short, I hope.
Oh, it was good. We've got a lot of time for questions.
That's
great. So we have time for questions. We have 2 microphones here. Please raise your hand and stand when they get to you, and they will hold the microphone for you.
That's smart. Good policy.
Hello?
I hear you.
They come through, okay. Ethanol is about 35% oxygen and hydrocarbons basically zero. And since it was used in California to complete the combustion process from carbon monoxide to carbon dioxide, is there some value for a certain amount of ethanol in gasoline, but probably well below 10%?
One can argue that if you're in an area like Los Angeles was, where you have essentially a giant basin or a bowl that concentrates your pollutant levels, especially in the wintertime when the air pressure comes down, the height of the atmosphere comes down because the air is cold, you do want to suppress the production of carbon monoxide. Whether adding ethanol to your fuel is the best way to do it is a different question, is an open question. I would say there was utility in it at the time because the carbon monoxide levels, carbon monoxide is the stuff that actually kills you, or it used to. It's why you'd run your car in your garage with your garage closed, because the carbon monoxide would build up and kill you. Now, curious enough, car emission systems are so good that you can't kill yourself that way anymore. You could suffocate yourself from a lack of oxygen if you stayed there long enough, but you couldn't. The carbon monoxide won't kill you. But yeah, it does make a certain amount of sense to knock that down. The levels in Los Angeles when they first started using it were quite high in the wintertime. They were high enough that, in theory, some people's health was being compromised, particularly children. Carbon monoxide is a chemical that binds to your red blood cells and prevents them from taking oxygen to your body, to your brain. And particularly in young children, the development doesn't really, it's not good for development. The evidence at the time suggested it wasn't good for development. So yeah, I think there's probably some niche applicability. Now, I think the catalytic converter technology at this point has gotten so good, and the computerized fuel mixtures are so good, you probably wouldn't want to do it with ethanol. But that, again, that's the unintended consequence when you create an industry, is it's self-sustaining, and it tends to prevent alternative solution pathways.
Cuba is known for its ability to grow sugarcane. Sugarcane is 7 times more efficient for ethanol production than is corn. Why is Cuba not turning away from sugar production and producing ethanol?
Well, and Brazil makes a large amount of money on sugarcane ethanol as well. Sugarcane is much more efficient as a feedstock to make ethanol. And in Brazil, where essentially they use the equivalent of slave labor to harvest it, the problem with sugarcane is that it's extremely laborious to harvest. And so you want the highest price use for the sugar that you can use. And in some cases, sugar subsidies and things like that mean you get more for the sugar and less for the ethanol. And it turns out that Brazil, actually, when you look at Brazil's economic development, even though they have largely an ethanol-fueled system for their cars, most of their income over the last 20 years has been from oil exports. So sugarcane would be a better crop, and some places that have lots and lots of sugarcane and have no liquid fuels. Again, you know, look at something like Hawaii, right? You have lots and lots of access to sugarcane, or you used to, and you don't have a lot of oil access or gasoline access. So there are places it makes sense to go with sugarcane. It has all very similar environmental impacts, a little less so than corn. So yeah, you can get away with sugarcane. Unfortunately, I don't know how well sugarcane grows in this environment, or in Kansas, where every politician goes to have an ethanol epiphany and decide they love ethanol. So there are limited places where you can grow sugarcane and have the manual laborers with machetes to harvest it really cheaply. We have lots of questions.
Dr. Green, thank you so much for your time today. My question is going to lend into the work that you've done with the United Nations, specifically the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, some would argue, post-ClimateGate email scandals, that the IPCC has undertaken a certain agenda rather than actual science. Now, how does the IPCC's advocacy, if there is advocacy, actually play into the ethanol debate that modern America has today? Thank you, sir.
Sure. Yeah, the IPCC. I reviewed for the record, the science volume of the third assessment report in its entirety, and that was a masochistic ritual that I engaged in when I decided I was going to start working on the subject. I decided I would read the giant omnibus reports that they put out that define our current understanding of the science. And no good deed goes unpunished, so I was then asked to review a special report on aviation and the global climate. That one was actually kind of fun because the chemistry is really obscure of what happens when a plane goes up in the air and puts out emissions. And it's not as if you can stick a muffler on the back of them. So the way it plays out is, and the IPCC is an interesting creature because it has gotten steadily more politicized over time. If you read the original first assessment report, nobody read it, and therefore it wasn't the big political football. Quite cautious in its conclusions. In fact, the first assessment report didn't come to a conclusion that humans were having a predominant effect on the climate. The second assessment report, when things got a little more political, started to have somewhat more aggressive statements. But again, the actual technical reports were pretty good in terms of saying, well, you know, if you double CO2 levels in the atmosphere, you could see a range of warming from 1.5 degrees C to 4.5 degrees C. We don't have any idea what it's going to be. And, you know, and so that was pretty good. The third assessment report, which I reviewed, was also good, although this is when they started to play some games, because they started to assign confidence levels to what they were saying, because they didn't think people were being scared badly enough. So they needed some new adjectives. And so they created a ranking system for how confident the scientists were in what they were doing. And they used, it was kind of amusing because this was one of my comments to their draft, which is, as they put it, they used an informal Bayesian meta-analysis of their findings to determine whether or not they were confident in them. And I looked into what that meant. And what it basically means is they asked the researchers who write the report themselves if they believe what they wrote. I kid you not. I kid you not. The researchers who write the reports have a little checkbox that says, I'm very confident in what I just wrote. And they've progressively refined and hidden that in the subsequent reports. They've gotten very good at doing something, at making the reports, the actual scientific reports, completely unquotable. So nearly every sentence is a paragraph long, and it's got 15 of these. We have low confidence to medium confidence in this, that, and the other thing. So they've largely become unquotable against the UN. And then, even more recently, they just released a report called the Synthesis Report that draws together these books and came up with a 40-page policy guide summary guide for policymakers. Those are rarely in any way balanced by the science in the underlying reports. How it plays out with the ethanol debate here, some people still believe that greenhouse gas emissions have to be controlled. Ethanol is seen as a carbon-neutral fuel because you capture the carbon out of the air in your corn, you burn it, you release the carbon again, and the cycle continues, kumbaya. And so as a, quote, carbon neutral fuel, that's where the pressure comes from for ethanol in the U.S. context today. And all biofuels, soybean-based biodiesel, Jatropha biodiesel, you name it. There is one technology I'm cautiously optimistic about for creating a biofuel, but that's algae. That's a subject for a different day.
Tell us a little bit about the subsidies, past, present, and future for ethanol.
Well, there used to be more. Some of the subsidies have actually been reduced. There were subsidies to farmers to grow the corn, and there were subsidies to the ethanol manufacturers to produce the ethanol. They have phased out the farm subsidy, I believe. They're still tapering down the manufacturer's subsidy, but I haven't looked at this in a couple of years. The bigger problem is the mandate itself is a subsidy. Right? When I require that you blend in X% of decaf into your coffee, right? I've now guaranteed you, forced you to buy the product at the same price of coffee. And so the existence of the mandate itself is the biggest subsidy. But they had also about 80 cents worth of subsidies directly, 80 cents a gallon to produce it in the beginning. That's where we got this, that's where the industry came from, is essentially they were built up on subsidies. Lots of questions in the front. All right, you back people. What are you doing back there?
That's why we're sitting in the front.
Yeah, I guess that's it.
We're
Front of
the
the classroom.
largest producers of ethanol used in the United States, and which of our politicians are deepest in the darkest corners of their pockets?
That's an interesting question. A lot of ethanol is produced by offshoots of oil companies in the States, but I can't tell you who specifically the largest producer of ethanol is. Steve, you have an idea? Oh, yeah, well by far the largest beneficiary of the whole thing would be Archer Daniels Midland, the people who used to do those lovely commercials on Sunday afternoon news programs, opinion programs. But as for the politicians, this is an equal opportunity despoiler, right? So on the eve of running for president, I think Bob Dole had a conversion in Iowa about corn ethanol. What's his name? McCain, who had run against ethanol fuel on the eve of campaigning in Iowa, changed his mind suddenly. Something about crossing the border into Iowa. It doesn't seem to matter what party affiliation you are. You cross the Iowa ethanol derangement line, and pretty soon you're for it. But you know, these lobby groups know the math of America, which is you can stop legislation if you get by one senator or 10 congresspeople, and if you're going to lose $10 billion, it's worth you throwing $2 billion to keep it. And so that's the built-in problem of American politics.
I have two questions.
Uh-oh, going to strain my memory here.
First question is, if Congress mandates catalytic converters, and catalytic converters convert unburned hydrocarbons into CO2, isn't it the official policy of Congress that CO2 is benign? And why is the EPA regulating it? The second question is if ethanol is driving the price of corn and has resulted in the reduction of animal herds and have driven up the price of beef, what accounts for the extremely low prices of corn right now on the market?
So the first question is, does Congress think CO2 is benign? I would argue it's actually more a matter of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing and deciding that they'd rather have perfectly combusted, they probably, first of all, okay, assuming that Congress understands what it means to have perfectly combusted gasoline is itself a stretch. But they probably assume that it's the lesser of two evils, right? If you complete the combustion, you do have some more CO2, but you have less carbon monoxide, less volatile organic carbon compounds, less nitrous oxides, less sulfur oxides, less particulate matter, et cetera. And so you might decide for the lesser of two evils because CO2 is non-toxic. And this was done before, the use of ethanol for those purposes was done before the greenhouse gases were driving practically all U.S. policy. Why is corn down now? Partly it's because gasoline's down and oil's down, right? So you're basically going to follow the price market at this point for what they can get for the fuel that's blended in. Plus, EPA, plus they have, I believe, backed off on the demand for cellulosic or for non-conventional forms, and they've reached their cap. That's the other thing, is that they're making as much ethanol as they can. They're at the conventional ethanol cap of 15 billion gallons, and so they're no longer driving up. It's not driving food prices higher or corn prices higher. And they've been so good at putting so much more land under corn that you now have a lot more corn. And there's another one, I think, back there.
We have, at the moment, two kind of contradictory policies in the federal government level. We
More
have,
than that.
well, much more than two, but specifically with the topic of ethanol, you have not only the RFS with its 15 billion gallon mandate, but you also have the federal government policy that requires automobile manufacturers to have their car fleets operating at a much higher level of fuel efficiency as we progress into the century. Ethanol, granted, has a lower efficiency than gasoline, and so it's actually less miles per gallon. How does the federal government plan, or do they even realize the problem that they're under of saying we want higher and better fuel efficiency, and at the same time we also want to put ethanol, which is worse fuel efficiency? In other words, what gives?
In my experience, government spends remarkably little time considering whether or not they're internally consistent. In fact, I suspect if they did, it would be a very beneficial thing because most of their heads would explode. And we'd get a smarter crop of evil politicians. But no, I think that they don't care. Again, the agenda on fuel economy is to knock down CO2 emissions. And so if they consider it, that's the be-all and end-all of vehicle fuel economy standards and regulations. To the extent that you get a value or a bargain out of it, they could care less. And so they don't. It doesn't strike them as a contradiction to make you put to simultaneously increase and decrease your vehicle's fuel economy with different mandates. That it's the net product at the end is, does it reduce greenhouse gas emissions or not? And if it does, then let's pass it, regardless of whether it makes your car an extra $10,000 in price, prevents people from getting into their car, into the car market, slows the overall industry down, and create other knock-on effects. It's a single value judgment. There's a gentleman here, one here, and one over there.
So could ethanol be more effective and efficient if they basically used waste? You were talking about the oranges, or if they just used corn stalks when the corn was already being used for something else. Do you think that if they used stuff that was already going to waste, that could possibly make ethanol more of a viable opportunity?
Well, there's two arguments. There's two arguments for that, which is if you really limited yourself only to using the waste product from corn that was going into the food market, you could make a good argument for that. But right now we plow that a lot of the times that's plowed back into the soil, right, to keep the soil organic content up. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be steadily depleting the soil and then having to add yet more fertilizer in to account for the fact that you've taken all the organic matter out of the soil, and so you wind up chasing your tail over time. Plus, the corn stalks, again, the problem with corn stalks is that the reason they're strong enough to hold up these gorgeous heads of corn we get is because the cellulose of the plant walls is thick and highly resistant to being broken down, right? You have to use, they use a steam process and then enzymes, which are quite expensive, to try to break down cellulose into sugar so that it can then be made into ethanol. Using waste crops, I mean, again, it's a good idea if you can do it economically and compete, or if you live in a place where you pay a huge premium for gas, premiums for, no pun intended, you pay a huge premium for premium. you might want to go that way. And race cars have been powered by methanol for a long time. Methanol is another option. But really very little beats gasoline, because as Robert Bryce will tell you, he'll probably give the lecture on fuel density, but when you think about the power, I'll beat him to the punch, which is when you think about the power embedded in gasoline or in oil, it's simply higher by any standard than comparable fuels. So, imagine a cup of ground wood pellets and how much of a fire that would make, how much food you could cook on that. Imagine a cup full of coal and how much you might be able to cook on that. Imagine a cup full of gasoline, and if you dripped it out onto a pan and let it burn, you could cook a lot more on that. And then what I tell students is, now imagine a cup of wind or a cup of sunlight, and you understand energy density right away. And so it just doesn't generally compete. So, but I was almost an entrepreneur.
Hi. So, correct me if I'm wrong on this timeline. Bush gave his speech in 2007 or 2006. Talking about ethanol and how it's a political, or he kind of had some sort of political motive there, maybe, just talking about it because he was a politician. But I've read that there was an initial surge, or a secondary surge in investment in ethanol in 2005, around then, is that right? Okay, so wouldn't that have meant that there was, and I've heard that the investment surge was based on the success of ethanol around 2005. Is that right as well?
Well, the investment wave was because you already had the requirement for conventional ethanol to go from where it was then up to its 15 billion barrel cap, right? And so with a government mandate in place, money flows. If I put a mandate in place, guarantee you a certain rate of return, I have my farm subsidies lined up, I have my subsidies to the ethanol manufacturers lined up, I threw a whole bunch of money into engineering schools to figure out how to lower the costs of refining, of producing ethanol, fermenting and distilling. So you'd see that surge anyway, but it wasn't related to the timing of the announcement on the cellulosic, other than to say that they wanted to increase the standard because of perceived energy insecurity. The Bush administration was big on energy security, and they perceived having a more domestic supply of liquid fuels would be good, and they bought the con of cellulosic ethanol, that they were being told by their scientists that it was ready for prime time, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course it was nowhere near ready for any kind of deployment, and it's still not ready for deployment. And I would predict it will not be ready for deployment for decades, and barring a technological breakthrough. Don't make him stand up. There we go.
It's my understanding that ethanol decreases the energy in gasoline by 30%. My next question is that before the industrial age, CO2 in the atmosphere was roughly 280 parts per million.
Yep.
It's now up to 380 parts per million.
Mm-hmm.
This has increased the fertilizing effect of CO2 by roughly 3% on all the crops.
Mm-hmm.
What's wrong with this?
From my perspective, very little. I mean, I think for the official record, since otherwise to differ with the revealed knowledge makes one a denier, I will simply state that I'm a climate acceptor. I know how CO2 works in the atmosphere, and that if you increase the concentration, you should trap some heat somewhere, a little bit. How much is the open question, whether it's a tiny amount or a larger amount. And my answer is there's two ways to figure that out. One, you can go to a giant climate model, computer model of the climate, which is like a bit like a computerized horoscope. Lots of predictions. You can go to that and you can plug your assumptions in, and you can crank your little lever and get any number out you want. Or you can actually look at what has happened to temperatures while greenhouse gas emissions have gone up since the Industrial Revolution. If you do that, you find a very mild rate of warming, probably around 1 degree centigrade. We use a metric system. 1 degree centigrade per doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere. That, to me, is not a major crisis, nor would trying to stop it be less damaging than the projected damage to those few areas where they're extremely low-lying or even almost under sea level, or they have huge prolonged droughts that could be made worse by a couple of tenths of a degree in a temperature increase. But yeah, many people have pointed out the fertilizing effect of CO2 on plant life. The planet is greener by far, but part of that also is policies we have where we've set aside huge amounts of area for reforestation as well as the establishment of a giant wood industry. So I don't find it a problem, but the politicians find it a problem, and that makes it my problem. Makes it all of our problem.
Someone asked about the price of corn being depressed, and you answered that part of it is because the ethanol cap was reached, what the market can absorb at that 10% of what is the consumption of the gallons of gasoline. But has there not been a greater effect brought on by an oversupply of corn? We've had a record harvest, and largely because the climate in the Corn Belt states was very favorable this past season, and there have been a big slaughter of cattle and other outlets where this might have been used because of the prior droughts that the nation suffered.
Right.
And so the supply and demand, I think, was more responsible for the price of corn falling. And from gasoline, the price is falling because fracking is competing. And the feedstocks for the gasoline are cheaper.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I'm not an ag economist. Because of the Byzantine way agriculture is run, I don't even pretend to be one on TV. But I think that's right. There is pressure to increase the amount of ethanol in gasoline. The ethanol industry would love to be mandated to go up to 15% blended into the fuel, with the result that they'd like to make that other 16 or 21 billion gallons of ethanol conventionally with corn. But the auto manufacturers are pushing back against that one because it would essentially kill any cars over like 5 years old, wouldn't be able to handle it. And then the gas stations are screaming that they'd be liable if the pumps were labeled wrong or there was mixing in a tank. And so we've been spared the 15% expansion. But I think you're right. It's multiple forces that have caused the fluctuation of both corn and gasoline.
My question was primarily answered. Thank you.
Psychic. Yeah, sure. I'm not going anywhere.
Given the small concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, can you give a quick explanation as to how this gas, a trace gas, can be causing all of these so-called problems, how it can raise the temperature as they claim it's going to?
Sure. The question was, given the very, very low composition of the atmosphere that CO2 represents, how is it having the effect that the people predicting warming say it does? And the answer is, basically, it's that you don't have to have a very high concentration to retain a bit of outgoing radiation from the Earth, because if you do it over the entire planet, it adds up. And environmentalists would come back and say, well, you need a very low concentration of cyanide to kill yourself. You don't need very high concentrations of the greenhouse gases. In fact, you need even less of methane because it's so much better at blocking outgoing radiation. So climate change 101, right? Sunlight comes in, gets absorbed by the Earth's surface, gets re-radiated out to space as long-wave radiation, infrared radiation you can't see. We just call it heat. But the gases, the greenhouse gases, hold it back because the molecules get excited when they get struck by the radiation, and they vibrate, and that generates heat in the atmosphere. And because of the layer of greenhouse gases, the Earth is warm enough to be habitable. Without it, it wouldn't be. And so it doesn't take a huge amount extra or a huge amount to have the effects they're talking about. As I said, if you look at the actual data and you look at the theory without folding assumptions into it about feedback mechanisms, like water vapor and like other, like a growth of icy fields and things like that, or shrinkage of ice fields. If you run just a straight model of physics, you would expect to get 1 degree centigrade, 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming if you double the concentration from the pre-industrial level. So that was talked about earlier. And that's Climate 101, Climate Change 101.
We have time for one more question.
If we have one more.
You mentioned dead zones as being one of the consequences of utilizing ethanol. My question is it the sole cause? And if not, how largely does it contribute to the problem relative to other sources?
It's a very large part of the. It's a very large part of the cause. It's not only corn. It's agriculture as a whole, but basically, when you fertilize fields, rain and watering mobilize the fertilizer, and eventually, as all things do, eventually it runs to the rivers, and from the rivers it runs to the oceans. And once there, it fertilizes algae blooms, and those algae blooms consume all the oxygen that would normally feed the fish. So it's a generic problem of agriculture, particularly, but corn is particularly an intensive crop with regard to the use of fertilizers. You have to use a lot of fertilizer to grow corn. And so now that's getting better, but of course the environmentalists are fighting against the very kinds of genetically modified corn that need less fertilizer. But we're getting better at using less fertilizer, but still the coastal oceanic dead zones are quite large as a result of agriculture in general.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Green. Yes, the reception will be on the mezzanine, and students, as a reminder, please use the stairway on the left. Thank you very much.